I've recreated a scene from The Lord of the Rings with absolutely no budget. That's £0 spent. All to prove that us YouTubers don't need Hollywood budgets to make amazing videos. Now, I'm being serious when I say that there's no money spent here. Unlike when I remade a scene from Avengers Endgame and bought a costume and Infinity Gauntlet, I'm not spending a penny. Instead, for anything practical, I'm going to use what I have around the house and what any of my friends can lend me.
For Frodo.
Then I'm going to recreate everything else in Premiere Pro, After Effects, and whatever other software I need to get the job done. But before all of that, I need to decide exactly which scene I'm going to make. One that's both complicated and requires VFX, but is also achievable on zero budget.
For Frodo.
That's right, we're remaking the moment that Aragorn charges down the armies of Mordor. Now there are quite a few tricky elements here, mainly being the costume and recreating the orcs. Not to mention the background, I've got to remake the whole thing from nothing. And to make this fair, I'm not going to use any assets from the movie itself, apart from these shots of Gandalf and Legolas to fill in these gaps. In other words, I can't just put my face on Aragorn's body. I'm going to have to recreate the shot from nothing, and then splice it into the final scene to see how seamlessly my version fits into Lord of the Rings. And boy oh boy, was it a process. The first thing I wanted to tackle and do really well on this project was Aragorn's costume. Now this is something I really struggled with when I tried to recreate Avengers Endgame. The Iron Man costume I got was just a skin-tight morph suit. Sorry ladies, but this time it's gonna be different. Having absolutely zero budget, I'm gonna have to think outside the cardboard box. That's right, I was going to be using cardboard boxes to make the armor for this project. Lucky for me, I came up with this idea a couple days before recycling collection happens. As well as this, I had gathered some packing tape, an old tube of silver paint, one cheap jacket from a Halloween costume, and a piece of red cloth. Thanks, Mum. I was going through the Lord of the Rings scene frame by frame, trying to pick out where the details were and how much cardboard I'd need. And as well as the armor, Aragorn has a cape in this scene. And it turns out that I might have something that will work for this. A while ago I made a sketch about being a Star Wars Jedi, and I just so happened to have bought a Jedi robe. I think this was going to be perfect. So after a little bit of searching and going into my costume box, I don't know, I found it again. So with the armor now planned out, I wanted to actually go see some real suits of armor and get some proper medieval inspiration. Now I love medieval history, so you know that your boy went to the absolute cream of the crop to get the best inspiration possible. The cast we went to had tons of armor, and it was actually surprisingly helpful to see this, as it gave me a good idea of the layers that are needed for a whole suit, and how I could make something similar with cardboard. But it didn't end there. I even asked random people on the street where I could find armor.
Hey man, listen, I'm looking for some armor. Do you know where any is?
There's like an antique armor shop that way.
That way, okay. Thanks very much, all right, see you later.
And yeah, I found some places. I got some inspiration, but not thanks to this guy. This guy sucked.
We couldn't help you as such.
And after my little medieval day out, I was ready to become Aragorn, son of Arathorn.
For Frodo.
Was it too big for my head?
I began with making the armor out of cardboard, as this was the thing that needed most time. Meanwhile, my cameraman Jack started tearing up the robe and turning it into a cape. In a strange sort of way, I was living out my 12-year-old me's fantasy. I always used to make random game and movie props out of paper and cardboard for fun, so doing it now technically is a part of my job. It's a dream come true. The trick with the armor was to eyeball the size of the individual layers and get the pieces to stack on each other in a way that A, looked like the movie, and B, wouldn't crumble the second I put it on. After the 2 layers of old silver cancerous paint had dried, yes, the paint is apparently cancerous, I started to put it all together. Something I'm really proud of here is the way that I got the armor to curve around my shoulder. I did this by taking pizza-shaped chunks out and then folding it over on itself and supergluing that. And it worked a treat. We'd finished the robe to cape conversion. Now we were just sticking on that red piece of cloth and making some armbands so that I could wear it. Something we attempted to do was recreate the pattern on Aragorn's breastplate, and this was one of those things that initially seemed like a genius idea, but as you'll see soon, turned out to be an absolute nightmare. And just like that, we were off to the countryside to film this thing. Now if you're wondering where I got this giant foam sword from, you have to believe me, I already owned it. I even mentioned it in this video on the outro. Will he A, buy another pizza? B, buy a medieval foam sword? I'm just a big old nerd, so put it down to that. Anyways, when we got to the location, the conditions were perfect. And the beauty of this scene is that we only needed to do 2 shots. Now, interestingly, for this one, I decided to shoot without a green screen, knowing full well I'd be utilizing rotoscoping only to cut me out from the background. The benefits of this were that the lighting on me would match the movie scene a lot better. Also, we wouldn't need to set up a giant green screen in a public field. And we got some nice cinematic breeze. There are obviously cons to this choice too, but those are problems for later. Let's film this shit for Finzar. And after a successful morning of filming, I was immediately back in the office, bringing all the clips into Premiere Pro and creating a rough cut with the footage we shot. Now, unfortunately, like I was saying earlier, some of our ideas didn't quite pay off here. Because of the wind, this pattern on Aragorn's chest plate just wouldn't stay on, so I had to cut around that and use clips which didn't have that problem. And once the rough cut was laid out, I was into After Effects to start rotoscoping. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and do two things here. Firstly, I'm gonna skip all of the boring rotoscoping which took about 5 whole days to do. Ooh, pink. Oh. And then secondly, I'm going to tell you the best settings for Rotoscope 3.0 that maybe you might find useful on future projects. It's worth bearing in mind that optimal rotoscope settings will vary depending on where you're shooting and the kinds of scenes they are. But I found this to generally be the most responsive and best looking rotoscope settings so far. So this is what we shot, and this is the rotoscope result. Now it's time to make a background inspired by the movie. Now I did all this in Photoshop using only Adobe's AI software, typing in a prompt and then searching through the results trying to find the best ones. The great thing about using AI is that you can just highlight an area and then type in what you want, and whatever it produces basically matches the lighting of the base image that it's putting itself onto. So anytime I added a mountain in the background, it looked perfect. And after a few hours of making this background and lots of trial and error, this was the final thing. And I gotta say, I'm really happy with it. Something I had to keep in mind was just how widescreen the footage is in Lord of the Rings, so I had to make this fit that aspect ratio. And after all of that, it was time to export into After Effects and layer it up. I selected the option that imports everything as separate layers. That way I could create a 3D environment out of all of those separate images. Now there's only one moving shot in this whole thing, and even then it's not too extreme. But that'll be the last thing that I tackle. So the next thing I focus on is creating the background elements like the moving flags, the smoke, and of course, the thousands of orcs behind me. Now I'm going to be creating a whole army of orcs, individually animated. It's going to take some real hard work, a little bit of knowledge, and a lot of perseverance. I will do right by you, Peter Jackson. But before I do that, I'm going to create some subtle background elements, like the Eye of Sauron and rolling clouds, and a massive silhouette of a group of people to have behind the orc army to bulk it out. I also added some war flags like in the movie, and some smoke rising from behind the army. And now for that final piece of the puzzle, the individual animated orcs. So I hop back into Photoshop and I start blasting away on the AI feature again, using the same technique before, using a background that I wanted the lighting to match. Now it's not too much of a problem that they don't look so much like the movie, because they're all going to be blurred out and really far away. But annoyingly, for some reason, Photoshop wants to make every single orc super hunky or very conventionally attractive, which is not what I wanted at all.
That Hansel's so hot right now.
So I used prompts like the word ugly, dirty, anything like that, and still Photoshop gives me clean, shiny, hunky orcs. So I made 4 PNGs of orcs that I was happy with. I gave them extra bits of armor, and then I brought them into After Effects. To animate them, I used the puppet tool. I put pins in all of the main parts of their body, and then I started animating with keyframes very subtle swaying motions, just like in the movie. This is what they all look like separately. Then after that, I sized them all down so that they're really far away. I changed the timing of all of them and then dot them across unevenly so that it looks random. And overall, I think it's really effective. One final touch that I'm going to add is the shadows of the orc army. Seeing as the Eye of Sauron is emitting a bright orange light, just like the sun, it makes sense to have the shadows coming from behind, like in the actual movie. So I do that by duplicating the grouped layer of orcs, flipping them upside down, changing the perspective so that it's slightly warped and facing outwards, and decrease the opacity. And this is the final look. Once I was happy with the image, I wanted to bring it into DaVinci Resolve, which was something that I did on my Iron Man video. The reason I did this was because DaVinci has so many different options when it comes to blending in the footage, especially with the glow effect, some light lens flare, and maybe even some light rays. And the beauty of this scene is that it lends itself so well to these effects because they're already in the film. The final piece of the puzzle was creating that 3D scene that I mentioned earlier. Seeing as I've had some practice making 3D environments from other videos, this was pretty easy. I just turned all of these 2D images into 3D planes, and then I sized them up and pushed them really far back to give a grand sense of scale. Then when everything's set out, I create a 3D camera and manually make the same camera move that I've made in real life. Now it's not going to be perfect, but I can create that same general sense of movement that we made with the camera when we filmed. And at the end of it, well, it looked pretty good.
Now you guys probably want to see the final product.
But I gotta bore you with an outro first. I had a lot of fun, I had so much fun doing this. I hate rotoscoping, okay? It's the worst thing in the whole world. But did I make the greatest scene of all time? I'm really proud of the way that this turned out. There's a little bit of me that thinks that it's just because I'm in my favorite franchise ever that I love it so much. But then there's another part of me which actually thinks, damn, that's pretty good. I like how I did those things. And I think they look pretty effective. All the way from those little characters that I made to the lack of green screen completely, just to match the lighting of the scene. I think it really paid off in just a kind of funny way, in a funny, you know, it's funny, right? It's funny. I think people would like it, right? I think it's a good video. Let me know what you think in the comments. It's over to you, knights and ladies, to decide. Roll the clip!
For Finzar.